Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Dungeon Siege for PC and Mac. Now, a lot of people consider this a role-playing game, but I don't. I consider it just a hack and slash because you're really not doing a lot of role-playing in this thing. If you're going to say it's a role-playing game, it is an extremely loose interpretation. But it was developed by Gas Powered Games and published by Microsoft in 2002, and it was actually designed by Chris Taylor. If you've played Total Annihilation or heard of that, or Supreme Commander, then you know about Chris Taylor, because he designed those as well. But this was released in 2002, and it was originally rated M because it had meaty chunk gore in it, and they eventually patched that out, and it got lowered the rating to teen. But it's interesting to see because this game actually had a pretty decent legacy behind it. I mean, Dungeon Siege 3 came out this year, so you can tell that the series had some success to it, and it also had some technical success as well. So the question becomes, is it a really good game like people seem to think it is, or were people just marveling at the technical aspects and kind of ignoring the gameplay? Well, at the time, the visuals were actually pretty solid. It had pretty decent modeling and animations. Surprisingly, the animations are pretty smooth. But if you look back on it, it really looks god-awful, because a lot of the textures are really low-res. I mean, this is the fairly early 3D era. Not a lot of role-playing games were actually converting to 3D graphics at that particular time. They were in that transitionary phase to it. And so this one looked slightly above the others in that particular regard, but at the same time they did have to compensate for other things. And this game does have one load time. It loads during the beginning, and you basically just kind of stream the rest of it throughout the entire game. Thus, you only have one load time the entire time you're playing. It's pretty awesome. So the technical achievement there was pretty mind-blowing. And especially considering how detailed the environments are. There actually is a lot of detail packed into these things. So it provides a pretty solid visual atmosphere. The problem I had with it was that the environments are very generic fantasy. It's basically just stone dungeons that look like every other dungeon we've been through. It's forests like we've been through all the time, and there's even desert sections. And the environments really didn't impress me much beyond being well detailed. Likewise, the enemy design wasn't particularly amazing either. It was fairly generic fantasy enemies that really didn't pop out in my mind. I mean, this thing has freaking beholders in it. So it basically throws in all of the generic fantasy creatures it could possibly find just to have them in there and so on and so forth. But still, the visuals for the time were really good, but looking back on them, really awful. And then, of course, the sound design is kind of a mixed bag. For one, you have actually really good music. Of course, it was composed by Jeremy Soule, so you really can't say it's going to be bad there. But this is one of his more early works, so it's not quite as refined as the stuff you hear more recently, like, say, with The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, or even Oblivion or Morrowind. But it is more reminiscent of the Morrowind stuff. It's fairly generic fantasy music, but it works really well, and some of it's actually fairly memorable. Like the main theme for Dungeon Siege is actually fairly memorable, and it does stick in my head. But the rest of the music, while it is pretty solid, it didn't really stick. It didn't really make a lot of impact on me. I did like it during gameplay, but I can't really just remember a lot of it, because they did actually recycle a lot of that main theme within different pieces, so that it just kind of gets tedious after a while. There's pretty much no voice acting to speak of, but the sound design, like the sound effects themselves, really not that impressive. I mean, they're just generic sound effects that you would kind of expect to do their job, and that's kind of it. So you have this really good music offset by a complete lack of voiceovers and just mediocre sound effects that ultimately creates a decent sound design, but it's nothing particularly memorable. But then we come to the story and the gameplay. Now, the game takes place in the Kingdom of Ebb, and you start off as a farmer in this little village, and all of a sudden, these weird little creatures called the Krug, I guess the best comparison I can make is that they're sort of like goblins, only not really. You just kind of have to see for yourself, I guess. But they attack and destroy your village, and so your dying friend tells you to go to Stonebridge and raise the alarm to say, hey, the Krug are attacking, we don't know what's going on here, all sorts of crazy stuff's going on, that sort of thing. And so you embark on this journey to Stonebridge, and when you get there you find out that this is a lot bigger than just an isolated incident, and eventually you get embroiled in this, basically, quest to save the Kingdom of Ebb from this massive evil force battering at it. It's a really generic storyline. It's not very good. Not very well written. The environments and everything, like the setting for the game, is decently written, but they really didn't explore it much, so there's really not that much of a point to it. Storyline basically just kind of fades into the background, and that's a problem, because you'll get these little segments of storyline, and they'll just give you some of the story. They'll tell you to go to the next area, and then you have to go there to get the next story bit. And between these areas, there can be sometimes 4 or 5 hours of gameplay. And the problem with that is, this is basically like a Diablo clone, only with a few alterations. For one, you actually level up your skills and your stats as you use them. So, like, you get melee and ranged weapons. You get nature magic and combat magic. And as you use these will level up, allowing you to use better spells or weapons and such like that, as well as increasing the damage you do with them and so on and so forth. You also get this effect with the stats, and these are strength, dexterity, and intelligence. These will just level up as you gradually use the things that are affected by them. Stat progression is insanely slow in this game, however, so you'll actually go through the entire game, and it will take you absolutely forever to level up your strength. So if you find, say, a decent weapon, then it'll have a requirement on it, and you'll be like, well, I can't use this. And so by the time you're able to use it, you've found better weapons, and so on and so forth, and it's just irritating. In addition, while the system itself is actually kind of cool because it means that you aren't limited by a specific class, you don't have to pick one at the beginning of the game and just roll with it. Instead, you can actually go through the entire game, deciding how you want to play it, and go through with that. While you can do this, it really isn't very conducive to the gameplay because you're just actually clicking. Literally, all you have to do in this game is to click in the center of a mass of enemies. Your character will run there, and then it will just take care of everything for you. The entire game is automated. And this is, I guess, a good thing considering how absurdly long it is and how tedious it is. Because you'll be sitting there and your character will be whacking on things, and you'll notice it is taking you hours to get through something that should only take you a few minutes, just because they throw hundreds, if not thousands, of enemies at you all at once. It takes forever, really slow, really irritating, and there's a lot of segments that really drag on but when you're going between these areas, and it just seems like it just goes on forever and ever and ever, to the point where you're just like, well, why do I care? This is taking way too long. It's way too irritating. So where this thing really fails miserably is its pacing. It is just so ungodly slow in the way you go about playing this game that it makes it really hard to actually get into. And on top of that, there's really not that much in the mechanics that allows for you to really pick a goal and go with it. In fact, there are only a handful of quests in the entire game, really. I mean, you get a few per area, but it's like 2 or 3. And so it's not really that impressive. You don't really feel like you're getting rewarded for doing these quests because you don't really get much from them, for the most part. And you just find better loot as you're going through the game normally. You'll kill stuff and you'll get an absolutely absurd amount of loot. And so I came to the conclusion in the middle of playing this game is all about loot. There is nothing to this game except kill thing to get loot, to sell loot, to get better loot. That's the entire game summed up right there. It is a loot gathering game. It is nothing else. If you say it's a role-playing game, it's not. You're not playing much. You're not doing much role-playing. You're sitting there just clicking on things, waiting for your character to whack things to death until you get their stuff, and then you can go sell that stuff or equip it and such like that. And so ultimately, Dungeon Siege is an extremely boring game, almost even more so than Diablo. And I'm talking, of course, about Diablo 1, by the way, not Diablo 2. I haven't played that yet. But it's just so ridiculously boring and tedious that I couldn't really, I couldn't even really force myself to finish it. I had to look up like endings and such. So it was just so boring to me that I couldn't stand playing it. Ultimately, that means it's a really, really awful game, despite its technical marvel. I mean, you can praise it for its technical achievement all you want, but this game is really not good. I give it a 1.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.